Hello, here's our final project, examining the ethical and legal complexities of date rape. This project is done by myself, Georgia, and my teammates, Selena, Jaden, Cynthia, Morgan, and Sky. So I first want to imagine that you are in a scenario. You'll make a decision now and a decision after a presentation where the scenario will be prompted again. It reads, imagine you are the defendant who is on trial for rape. You carry an honest belief that you didn't rape someone, although the plaintiff has made a statement that she did not consent, but it is your honest belief that she did consent. Do you plead guilty or not? Now I want to introduce you to our central question that we aim on answering during this presentation. Is an alleged date rapist's honest belief that the victim wanted to have sex, despite not having said yes, a sufficient defense against the charge of date rape? For our sources, we used a journal article called Date Rape, a Feminist Analysis by Lois Pino from the Journal of Feminist Philosophies, Problems, Theories, and Applications, 2nd edition. Firstly, we plan on acknowledging our standpoint in the issue in this presentation, as it is a topic that is very relevant and we are an all-female team. By acknowledging this, it can reveal any biases we have in the matter. Secondly, we are going to summarize the reading so you can see our reasoning when we answer our central question. So by the end of this presentation, you can go back to the scenario and see if you would answer it differently. Thirdly, we are going to reveal if the author is taking a relationalist or a pluralist perspective. Fourthly, we are going to answer our central question by using Pino's article as our sole source. And then lastly, we plan on acknowledging our biases or limitations in our reasoning.
So, to begin our viewpoints and thoughts on the topic, our group had become interested in this topic as it's quite a relevant and current topic that is circulating, as it's been a lot more frequent, even here in Prince Edward Island, as well as we've also observed that there are now creative preventative measures to try and lessen the rate of date rape. Not only that, but it's interesting to know about the legalities and ethical notions involved in general cases of date rape. We're curious to know and learn if these legalities and ethical notions have any relation to love and sex. So our whole group consists of females, and all of us have experienced a fear of it, as it's laid in the back of our minds because you never know when things could go downhill when you're out, whether it be on your own or with other people. It's also quite worrisome that statistics point out that males are the perpetrators in most cases, while females are the victims, so all females can relate or learn more about this topic in one way or another. As for our family and cultural backgrounds, socio-economic factors, and life experience, they influence our perspective in many ways, as we come from different factors, backgrounds, and experiences. The majority of us are Maritimers, so we're able to have a similar viewpoint on this topic. The curriculum has touched upon the basics of date rape, such as what it is, how it happens, and ways it can be prevented, which reflects the socio-economical aspect of our viewpoint. Our families are also aware and have knowledge about date rape, as they remind us to watch our drinks and not to lose sight of our drinks, which reflects on how important it is and how popular this topic is even for rural Prince Edward Island. So, Georgia has had an experience she included about date rape in her essay about how she was roofied when she was out one time. Luckily, she had a friend that was able to help her out and get her home safe. This influences Georgia's perspective, as she could have experienced date rape, but at least she's had the experience of being roofied, as she now knows the bodily feeling of helplessness once there and the drugs that are involved, which happens in a lot of date rape cases. As for Cynthia, she comes from a differing cultural background with different expectations. From the story she described in her essay about a female in a pageant who was from Rwanda, which is where Cynthia is from, and she came forward about being raped in the past, and she ended up being publicly shamed for sharing her story. What we learned, though, is that the younger generation seem to be more supportive and accepting of sexual assault in Rwanda, which shows that there's a change within the perspective in our country in regards to victim blaming when it comes to rape as a whole. This clearly shows that being from a different cultural background can prove that we see issues, mainly date rape in this case, a lot differently.
Hello, so I will be giving a short summary of the article written by Lois Pino, titled Date Rape, a Feminist Analysis. After reading Lois Pino's article, we were able to take quite a few things from what she had to say. Pino defines date rape as a non-aggravated sexual assault, non-consensual sex that does not involve physical injury. As we already know, mens rea is the Latin word for having a guilty mind. Pino points out that in court, mens rea must be present in order for it to be constituted as rape, which would then mean the victim did not consent. Mens rea can, however, be defeated, but if the defendant has a reasonable belief the plaintiff has consented, the defendant's belief must be sincere and reasonable. But how do we prove the man sincerely and reasonably believed that the plaintiff was consenting? And say he did sincerely believe it was consent, and it could be proven. How can we assume the plaintiff felt the same, and as though they believed it was consent? Pino brings up the point of society and the courts having a difficult time deciphering between assault and seduction, as well as submission and enjoyment. There are two very common beliefs that greatly affect women's stance in courts involving consent. The first one being that women should not behave sexually unless they are prepared to carry out some sexual interaction. And the second one being the woman being coy about them not wanting sexual interactions is their way of avoiding responsibility for admitting or acting upon what they want. There is various obvious problems with this belief. The most obvious problem with these beliefs is that we are putting women in a position where no matter how they act or feel, they are at risk of unwanted sexual interactions. In the end, Lois Pino offers up a solution to this problem by the practice of communicative sexuality, which combines the appropriate knowledge of others with respect to the dialect of desire. A question in order to get a critical angle on Pino's analysis is it fair to get charged with date rape just because you're not a good listener and you didn't realize she was not consenting, and so you forced yourself on her? Yes, it is fair to get charged with date rape even though you were not a good listener and you didn't realize she was not consenting. Let me first say that not being a good listener is no excuse for raping someone. Claiming to be a bad listener because you didn't listen to or ignored what the other person had to say to avoid criminal liability is called being willfully blind. You don't even have to be a good listener to know when someone is not consenting based on body language and the obvious no answer regularly given from those who fall victim to such crimes. If you are not receiving enthusiastic responses, if someone isn't capable of making informed decisions, if you are not paying attention to nonverbal cues like they are pushing you away, if you had to pressure or convince them into it, or if you had to use your position of authority, you are to assume the person has not consented.
Relationist view. So the relationist view, it's focused on valuing equality and mutuality in relationships, understanding sex as an expression of love and relatedness. It also stands up for a lot of rights of different marginalized groups or just people groups that are being oppressed. So it opposes the subordination of women, of GSD groups, of racialized groups, of cultural or language or religious minorities, of economically disadvantaged groups, and of other marginalized groups. And it also rejects patriarchal values that marginalize the role of love and sex and put in its place objectification and violence. So this is the view that we all found that the article had taken, opposed to the pluralist view. So Pino says in her article, the belief that the natural aggression of men and the natural reluctance of women somehow make rape understandable underlies a number of prevalent myths about rape and human sexuality. So I found that this quote really summed up the purpose of the article in speaking about how femininity and masculinity and the certain ideas that surround those two concepts come into place in situations like when a date rape occurs, and how it can make it difficult for the court system and there to be legal prosecution that takes place against someone who commits that sort of crime. So some more of the differences that I found that showed that the article was written from a relational standpoint is that a pluralist more focuses on individual freedom, while relationists focus on equality and mutuality. Relational thinkers oppose some of the pluralist views because of the fear that by promoting everyone's right to choose, that is really keeping the social patterns in place that are causing so many of the issues surrounding the degradation of women and behavior that is interpreted as seductive is often treated as a contractual agreement, because it is viewed that women are not allowed to act sexual unless that means that they are going to act on that. Sexual assault is treated as if it is a masterful seduction, and the silent submission of the woman is interpreted as sexual enjoyment. Pino explains how aggression by men has become an expected part of seduction. So the problem with making things like men being aggressive seen as natural is it makes it seem like it is excusable. So aggression has become expected part of seduction, and it is seen natural for a woman to be reluctant and males to be aggressive. And that becomes an issue because it seems like it's normal for a man to have to convince a woman somehow to sleep with him, and it makes it much more complicated in instances of date rape.
When it comes to consent, it has been remarked that some men can tell when women are really saying no or if they are playing hard to get. When there is a case that the woman agreed to have a sexual relationship with a man, her action and engagement during the encounter are going to show more responsibility in what is happening. And if there is any type of discomfort that is felt midway, the woman can still say no and the sexual relationship has to stop. This is to men it is yes only if it was in the beginning, during the encounter, until the end. If this changed during the encounter and it was not stopped, then it can be considered as a date rape case.
Just because the woman was consenting at the beginning, this doesn't mean that she can't change her mind in the middle of sex. And it is stated that men find it hard to actually control their sexual urges mid-encounter, and it is hard for them to stop. And this then results in date rape. Yes means that there was a yes at the beginning of their sexual relation, it was yes during the sexual relation, and it was a yes even till the end. I think the wording in the sentence that men find it hard to stop comes across wrong to the reader. What the statement in the essay actually meant is that once people begin doing things, whether they are good or bad, we often are not disciplined enough or do not act on any self-control that we may have to stop. This is no excuse for date rape, but rather is just an explanation for how in the moment people are often capable of doing bad things, and especially in our society because we have deemed it acceptable to act on these aspects of what we believe about our natural characteristics, such as sexual aggression in men. And I do believe that sentence should not have been worded that way, because sentences such as those are what are keeping society confined to an oppressive way of thinking.
So I will be discussing the difference between honest and reasonable belief. Honest belief is having the true belief that the act under the circumstances in which you committed it was not wrong, while reasonable belief exists when there is a reasonable basis to believe that a crime is being or has already been committed. The difference between the two is that honest belief is the opposite of reasonable belief, as it's also known as unreasonable sincere belief. One also has to be able to defeat mens rea, which is reasonable belief. As Pino had stated, in quotes, if his belief to consent is reasonable, then the court is able to believe in the sincerity, but usually this is due to some form of evidence that's involved. But with honest belief, if the man is not able to defeat mens rea, the court is less likely to believe that his belief is sincere.
Why is a date not a contract to have sex? To answer this question, we first have to understand what's a date. I think, in my opinion, a date is a form of courtship that involves maybe a meetup between two people to determine whether they can be involved in a more intimate relationship or see if they're compatible. It has been observed that men most of the times feel entitled to have sexual relationship with women after a date without even considering asking if they're consenting to it. Taking a quick example from Lois Pino's Date Rape, the confession of the date rapist, where he said he doesn't take no for an answer and he believed it was what belonged to him to have a sexual relationship with a woman, and if the woman said no, it will bruise his ego and make him angry to the point of forcing himself on the woman. If a woman accepts to go out on a date with a man, this doesn't mean she agreed to have sex with them. There has to be a form of consent. Another good example that Pino gives on page 182 and 183, it clearly shows how much men feel entitled to have sex with a woman after a date without considering whether they're on the same page with this. Still, basing on both examples given in Lois Pino, the man believed having sex with a woman after a date was his right, and until men understand that sex is a privilege, not a right, then the date rape culture is far from being broken. When growing up, men are taught that if a woman is saying no to their sexual advances, it doesn't mean that the woman doesn't want it. Rather, the man is asking the wrong way. Women are considered as riddles that one has to solve, and if you have the right answer, everything you want will be granted to you. All this without considering the woman's view or right. When I was trying to find some topics that talk about it online, I stumbled on something that I didn't know existed, and it's called incel forums. These involuntary celibate men forums have for a purpose to totally diminish women, and the people who go on them are the type of people who feel like they are entitled to have women just because they are men. I will attach a little link below on my paper to one of the articles about it. It is really sad how women most of the times are considered as object, and how much what they think or have to say is never considered. It is very sad because some people get to the point to commit incel attacks and kill people because they felt entitled to have a person who did not want them. Going back to our topic and simply summarizing it, a date is not a contract to have sex because sexual relationships have to be a person's right to engage in it and not an entitlement or prize of some kind.
In Pino's article, she points out some biases. Firstly, she points out that a court is less likely to believe a man who says he thought the woman was consenting if it would be unreasonable or irrational to form that belief in the circumstances, judging from what the woman did and said. Likewise, the court is more likely to believe the man's claim if it thinks that it would be reasonable to form such a belief in these circumstances. Secondly, the article was written in 1989, and at this time there was very little protection from sexual assault for a woman who was on a date with a stranger. This is partly because it is very hard to validate the woman's claim that she did not give consent, and even when it is agreed that the woman had protested and resisted sex, the courts often do not interpret this as women actually withholding consent to sex. Therefore, this makes it virtually impossible to prove in court that a man is guilty. With this, Pino argues that a better understanding of sexuality would make the judicial system more fair for women. Pino is not trying to argue that date rape is wrong, however, it seems that she is taking this for granted. Her aim is to show that the legal procedure for judging accusations of date rape are biased against the victim of the rape. She believes that the process is biased because it makes assumptions about the nature of sex and the differences between male and female sexuality, which are totally wrong. Pino completely disagrees with the assumptions about male and female sexuality that are made in this justification of date rape, and suggests that women should be able to be provocative without fearing assault. She points out the absurdity of the myth, saying that if women want sexual pleasure, they are not going to get it through getting themselves raped. She also spends time carefully arguing against the assumptions that might provide a justification for the date rape.
So this concludes the end of our presentation. We talked about our viewpoints on the topic, we summarized Lois Pino's article, we answered a handful of questions, and even answered the central question, and yeah. So I'm just going to paint the same scenario as we did in the start. Imagine you are the defendant who is on a trial for rape. You carry an honest belief that you didn't rape someone, although the plaintiff has made a statement that she did not consent, but it is your honest belief that she did consent. Do you plead guilty or not? Hopefully this gives you like a ballpark scenario and helps you answer this question a little more. And yeah, that concludes our presentation, and we hope you enjoyed.